1. Trump announces plan to send more defensive weapons to Ukraine. 2. Pentagon halts air defense aid for Ukraine amid Russian drone strike surge. 3. Who's really in charge of American defense policy? 1. Trump announces plan to send more defensive weapons to Ukraine. In a dramatic shift amid escalating tensions, President Donald Trump announced plans to send additional defensive weapons to Ukraine, reversing a controversial pause on shipments just days earlier. This move comes as Kyiv faces relentless Russian drone attacks and appeals for stronger aerial defenses. But here's where tensions rise. The decision follows a Pentagon review criticized for prioritizing military readiness against China over Ukraine's immediate needs. Speaking ahead of a meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Trump emphasized, "We're going to send more weapons. They need to defend themselves, they're getting hit very, very hard." The president reiterated the focus on defensive systems, though critics argue the distinction between defensive and offensive aid often blurs in modern warfare. The temporary halt, confirmed by White House officials last week, included air defense missiles and sparked backlash. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth defended the review, stating it aimed to balance Ukraine's needs with America's long-term defense priorities, particularly countering China. "We must preserve our readiness for future conflicts," Hegseth argued, a stance that reignited debates over foreign policy strategy. Russia quickly seized on the pause, claiming, without evidence, that the U.S. was running out of weapons. But here's the twist: the Kremlin's statement ignored the broader context of U.S. stockpile management and industrial production challenges. Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell clarified that the new shipments align with an America First framework, ensuring Ukraine's defense while safeguarding U.S. interests. Since 2022, the U.S. has supplied Ukraine with over $100 billion in aid, including Patriot missile systems, drones, and tanks. However, Trump's March 2025 freeze on all military aid, following a reported clash with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, raised concerns about inconsistent support. The president resumed aid days later but reiterated calls for European allies to step up contributions. Zelensky's recent plea for advanced air defenses coincided with record Russian drone strikes, including a massive assault hours after Trump's call with Putin. While Trump described his discussion with Putin as disappointing and acknowledged no progress toward peace, he praised his talk with Zelensky as very good, signaling potential approval for additional Patriot systems. So, where does this leave the war effort? Supporters argue the weapons are vital to Ukraine's survival, while critics warn of escalation risks and domestic stockpile depletion. And this is the part most people miss: the Pentagon's pivot toward China could fundamentally reshape U.S. involvement in global conflicts. Is prioritizing future Pacific threats over current European stability a strategic necessity or a betrayal of allies? As Trump navigates these competing interests, one question lingers: can the U.S. sustain its role as Ukraine's lifeline without jeopardizing its own readiness? Share your thoughts below, and let's keep the conversation going. 2. Pentagon halts air defense aid for Ukraine amid Russian drone strike surge. The stakes have never been higher for Ukraine as Russian drone strikes escalate alarmingly, yet crucial air defense support from the Pentagon remains on hold. In recent weeks, there has been a staggering surge in Russian drone attacks against Ukraine, coinciding with delays in the delivery of essential air defense materials, notably the highly sought-after Patriot interceptors. The intensity of these drone strikes has increased by approximately 500% during June and July when compared to earlier months of this year, as reported by the Institute for the Study of War. Fred Kagan, a prominent figure at the American Enterprise Institute, emphasized the dire situation: the Ukrainians are enduring relentless assaults at an unprecedented intensity. They urgently require all types of air defenses. The night of July 3 marked a drastic escalation, with Russia launching the most extensive drone and missile attack scene in the over 3-year conflict, unleashing over 530 drones and at least 10 missiles primarily targeting the capital. This onslaught tragically resulted in at least 2 fatalities and left more than 90 individuals injured, with the attacks extending into July 7. Over the past week alone, President Volodymyr Zelensky revealed that approximately 1,270 drones and 39 missiles were fired at Ukraine. This troubling uptick in aggression coincides with a pause by the Pentagon on certain weapons shipments to Ukraine, including vital air defense systems such as the Patriots. According to Pentagon spokesperson Sean Parnell, this pause is part of a capability review, ensuring that U.S. military aid is consistent with our defense priorities. However, this decision has not been well received. Democratic officials are deeply concerned, with Adam Smith, the leading Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, identifying air defense as the biggest concern, without question. He dismissed worries that supplying military aid to Ukraine and Israel is exhausting U.S. stockpiles, stating, "The stockpiles I've seen are no lower than they've been over the last 3.5 years since Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine." Smith expressed confusion about whether this pause indicates a misguided assessment of our national security needs or if it serves as an excuse to allow Putin to escalate his campaign in Ukraine. In a joint statement dated July 3, Senators Jack Reed and Chris Coons, significant Democratic members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, called the halt in aid the latest and most dramatic blow to our support for Ukraine. They reiterated that this assistance, which includes critical air defense interceptors and artillery munitions, was procured through contracts approved by Congress and should have been delivered months ago. Kagan added that targeted Russian drone assaults facilitate the use of ballistic missiles that can breach Ukraine's defenses. The absence of Patriot interceptors, he warns, leaves Ukraine vulnerable to Russian forces shooting their ballistic missiles at will. Patriots are, notably, the only air defense system capable of intercepting ballistic missiles. In recent discussions, both Zelensky and former President Donald Trump have acknowledged Ukraine's urgent need for enhanced air defense, but as of now, no agreement has been finalized. Zelensky remarked, "We had a highly productive conversation with the President of the United States yesterday, focusing on air defense," during a video statement on July 5. Echoing this sentiment, Trump mentioned to reporters aboard Air Force One that Ukraine indeed needs Patriots for defense, stating, "They are facing intense pressure and need something to protect themselves." He expressed frustration over a recent call with Russian President Vladimir Putin, asserting, he wants to carry on indefinitely, without any regard for human life. It's worth noting that Trump had previously paused military assistance to Ukraine in March after a contentious Oval Office meeting with Zelensky, raising additional concerns about the future of U.S. support. But here's where it gets controversial. Is the Pentagon's weapons delivery halt a strategic re-evaluation for U.S. security or an unwitting gift to Putin's aggressive aspirations? What are your thoughts? Could pressing U.S. aid actually put Ukraine at a disadvantage? We invite you to share your opinions and engage in this critical discussion. 3. Who's really in charge of American defense policy? #### Who's in charge of American defense policy? In today's world, the question of who truly governs American defense policy is more pressing than ever. It's a topic that deserves our attention, especially considering the complexities and controversies surrounding it. Do you recall the moment when the United States launched an act of war against a nation with a population of approximately 90 million by deploying its B-2 bombers? If that memory has faded, you're not alone. It happened over 2 weeks ago, and many have been preoccupied with more recent developments. For instance, the U.S. has recently suspended certain arms shipments to Ukraine, even as Russian forces intensify their bombardment of Ukrainian cities, continuing their brutal campaign. In a rather surprising turn of events, former President Donald Trump attempted to reach out to his counterpart in Russia, President Vladimir Putin, last Thursday. Unfortunately, it seems that Putin was not receptive to Trump's overtures. As Trump himself reported, "I didn't make any progress with him today at all," just before he boarded Air Force One. In another significant development, the president has initiated a review of AUKUS, the security agreement established in 2021 between the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. This unexpected move has left U.S. diplomats, as well as their counterparts in Canberra and London, feeling unsettled about the future of this crucial alliance. Interestingly, it was not the president who made this decision directly, it was his appointed Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. However, the real impetus behind this review appears to stem from Elbridge Colby, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, a figure who may not be widely recognized but has been influential in shaping these policies. On the Asian front, CNN has reported, citing a Ukrainian intelligence source, that North Korea is contemplating sending an additional 30,000 troops to support Russia in its ongoing military endeavors. While this information is based on a single source, it's worth noting that North Korea has already dispatched at least 10,000 soldiers to the European theater over the past 9 months. Given the dire situation facing Russian conscripts, it raises the possibility that a deal is indeed in the works to provide the Kremlin with more foreign troops. This leads us to a critical question: who is actually steering the ship of American foreign and defense policy? It seems that the president is not the one in control, at least not on most matters. Trump's engagement with foreign policy, much like his approach to various issues, is often erratic and inconsistent. He tends to abandon topics that are not yielding favorable outcomes, leaving them for others to handle. Although he once claimed he could resolve the conflict in Ukraine in a single day, he has since acknowledged that achieving peace is more difficult than people would have any idea, and has seemingly lost interest. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, is also not the one calling the shots. Despite holding this title, he appears to wield little influence within the current administration. Hegseth, on the other hand, seems preoccupied with discussions about military lethality and social issues, rather than providing substantial briefings that would inform policy decisions. His performance pales in comparison to that of the State Department spokesperson, Tammy Bruce, whose enthusiastic praise for Trump often resembles the rhetoric of a state-controlled media outlet. Even the National Security Advisor role, which Rubio occupies, does not seem to carry much weight in shaping policy. It appears that the real architects of American defense policy are individuals like Elbridge Colby and perhaps a few others operating within the Washington, D.C. area. Their influence is not always transparent. For example, while the order to halt arms shipments to Ukraine came from Hegseth, the original concept was reportedly driven by Colby, who has long advocated for reducing U.S. commitments in Ukraine and reallocating resources to counter China in the Pacific. However, analyses from the Joint Staff suggest that this perspective may be misguided, as the Ukrainians require support that the U.S. would not utilize in a Pacific conflict. In this administration, it seems that key figures are either incompetent or disconnected from the actual policymaking process, resulting in decisions being made at lower levels without adequate oversight. During Trump's first term, this dysfunction was somewhat mitigated by the presence of career professionals who knew how to maintain operations. However, in his second term, many of these experienced individuals have been sidelined or replaced by loyalists and inexperienced appointees. Ironically, this shift has empowered the very appointees that the MAGA movement criticizes in other administrations. The policymaking process in the Trump White House resembles that of many authoritarian regimes, where the upper echelons focus on a few major initiatives while delegating everything else to lower-level officials. These officials then pursue their own agendas, as seems to be the case with Colby, or they simply do enough to avoid drawing attention from the president. In this environment, it appears that Trump is the only one truly in charge, which means that on most days, and for many issues, no one is really in charge at all. Currently, the administration is primarily focused on two major initiatives: irrational tariffs and stringent immigration enforcement. While both have implications for foreign policy, they are being pursued mainly as domestic political strategies. Other significant issues, such as relations with Pakistan and India, nuclear weapons, and the ongoing war in Ukraine, receive only fleeting attention from Trump, evaluated solely for their personal utility before being cast aside. Even the recent military strike against Iran, a pivotal action for the U.S., seems to have lost its significance for the president. Trump claimed that Iran's nuclear capabilities were obliterated, but conflicting reports from defense and intelligence agencies suggest uncertainty about the actual damage. Despite Israel expressing gratitude for U.S. support, Trump has moved on, possibly because the anticipated political benefits of the strikes did not materialize, as public opinion turned against him. Today, Trump's attention appears to be shifting towards Gaza, where he recently expressed optimism about negotiating a deal with Hamas for the release of hostages. This encapsulates the essence of foreign policy in the Trump era: announce potential agreements, delay their resolution, and hope for favorable outcomes. If those outcomes do not materialize, the administration simply moves on and claims success, regardless of the reality. No one within Trump's administration seems motivated to rectify this situation, as making significant changes would imply acknowledging past failures. Rebuilding the National Security Council with qualified individuals would mean admitting that their expertise was necessary from the outset. Similarly, if Hegseth or other top officials were to resign, it would highlight the substantial errors made in their appointments. Attempting to rein in policy freelancers and limit the influence of lower-level decision-makers would suggest that senior leaders have lost control over their departments. This administration has never been structured or staffed with a coherent foreign policy in mind, beyond Trump's vague America First rhetoric. Less than a year into his second term, it is evident that the primary objectives of Trump's 2024 presidential campaign are to avoid imprisonment, seek retribution against his adversaries, and enable himself and his allies to profit in every conceivable way. There has been little consideration given to who will safeguard America or manage its diplomatic relations. Trump's appointees seem to have been selected more for their shock value than for their qualifications. In contrast, the world's most powerful nations are led by experienced professionals. Some of these nations are adversaries of the United States and pose significant threats. While Undersecretary Colby may have some questionable ideas, Americans can only hope that he and the small group of individuals attempting to manage these complex issues are competent enough to navigate the challenges ahead.